Welcome back. Today we are going to be looking at a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again by David Foster Wallace. There's a couple essays in particular I want to read some excerpts from, do some close reading of, and basically reflect on because it's now been over 2 decades since he's published these, almost 25 years. So you can see quite a silly, sort of boyish looking cover behind me. It's interesting, at this time, he's already being jacket quoted as sort of one of the preeminent talents, and him and Jonathan Franzen and Eugenides and, all these sort of young, at the time, youngish, under 40 white guys who are the next generation of American authors or American talent. And at that time in the 90s, no one is thinking of them as the last generation or the last generation to at least do certain very traditional things like publish big paperback tomes of books, and also other things like career-wise, they made legitimate money in magazines, right? And that's what these essays are. This is a legit job, profession. Of course, Foster Wallace did do some teaching as well, but you can make a living publishing as a magazine writer for the second half of the 20th century. And in the era of the internet and the era we live in now, certainly there's people who make publishing, viable without a gatekeeper through things like Substack or newsletters. This is an entirely different medium. So this long format essay, paid for by big budget magazines in New York, which we'll see in the text is something that Foster Wallace pushed back against a bit, was in some ways a real privilege, and a privilege for us as readers as well. So we're going to go through some of these quotes, and then I want to start by diving into the essay called David Lynch Keeps His Head, which to me is really intriguing, and that I feel like the anecdotal and personal stuff about being on a film set, as Wallace is a big film fan, but also the recent re-release or remake of the Dune series, and that the original Dune by David Lynch is talked about quite a bit in this essay, if I remember correctly. So I haven't reread it, but I'm going to go back and look at my annotations and notes, and hopefully we'll find some fun stuff to talk about. So let's dig into it. You can see New York Observer, the title essay is worth the price of the book alone. So that's a famous one he did for Harper's, and he goes on a cruise ship, and he basically takes down this idea of a cruise ship as being fun and says it's kind of infantilizing, or really is about being forced to be childlike and have all your events and activities and time taken care of. Sorry, I think my camera's a bit too tight. Anyways, hopefully it works. We're still figuring this format out. This is so great. He has Gore Vidal's biting wit, Christopher Hitchens' ability to disrobe intellectual imposters, and Pynchon's sense of the bizarre. Not just refreshing, it's downright... Oh gosh, this is such a different era. I kind of like it, looking back at these, even just the quotes. The Buffalo News, the OC Weekly, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. I mean, all these local newspapers are literally dead now. So we can see this is like a historical document at this point. Funny as all get out. This guy uses words like ninja uses throwing stars. Wallace proves that cutting edge is a term that needn't be reserved for fiction only. Ooh, and there's one from James Wood for Newsday. A marvelous book. Sparkling reportage. If one wants to see the zeitgeist auto-grappling in all its necessary confusions, one must read every essay in this book. Another interesting aspect of this, of course, is like the huge pushback that came, a decade or 2 decades later on honesty and reality in reporting, and whether Foster Wallace was using hyperbole and exaggerating things, and if, in fact, this whole process of creative nonfiction and narrative nonfiction is real or not. I think also here of like Kapuscinski and Imperium and the Soccer Wars and some of his books, which were also criticized heavily after he passed on. So, without further ado, let's dig into that David Lynch essay. David Lynch Keeps His Head. I have no idea how many quotes or annotations I have to read from this one, but we'll just scroll through and see how it goes. So, David Lynch's Lost Highway, or what movie this article is about. So it literally starts with a kind of meta thing, and there's one capital title, as you can see over my head there. Curious. David Lynch's Lost Highway, written by Lynch and Barry Gifford. Gifford, of course, also extremely famous, well-known cinema writer. Featuring Bill Pullman, Patricia Arquette, Balthasar Getty. Wow. Financed by Sibi 2000 in France in 1996. A wonderful year. So I was just a teenager back then. Lynch's companies are right next door to Lynch's own house in Hollywood Hills, and whose logo, designed by Lynch, is a very cool graphic that looks like this. So this is already, we're getting sort of this trademark Foster Wallace stuff where he really starts to get into the schematics, the logos, the jargon, and the deep dive specificity. In some ways, he's a precursor for the internet age of deep dives and what we hear in podcasts now. That was sort of his thing, right? Going way too far into a topic for popular media and picking apart the nitty gritty, the details, and the minutiae of something. So he admits really early on here, quote, "I'm a fanatical Lynch fan from way back, though I did make my pro-Lynch fanaticism known when the asymmetrical people were trying to decide whether to let a writer onto the set. The fact is, I was led onto the set of Lost Highway because of Premiere Magazine's industry juice, and because there's rather a lot at stake for Lynch and asymmetrical on this movie. They probably feel like they can't afford to indulge their allergy to PR and media machine quite the way they have in the past." So again, you see, Foster Wallace immediately gets right into this self-referential stuff, this sort of meta look. And of course, now Facebook has tried to steal and co-opt the use of the word meta on planet Earth. We can't say meta now without thinking of Zuckerberg, but it has nothing to do with that. It's just about self-referentiality. And Premiere Magazine was a, popular culture, I'd say, checkout aisle of the grocery store movie magazine. I'm sure it's out of business now. I haven't looked, but I have no idea that, reporting on the behind the scenes and how to of Hollywood, and of course the life of the stars. So our next section, what David Lynch is really like. And he starts by saying, "I have absolutely no idea." So there's some immediate self-criticism. And Wallace later talked to about how the voice in a lot of these essays is really, it's a straw man he's made of himself, where he plays dumb or criticizes himself, or played the sort of silly boffo buffoon type where, he shows up as an ignoramus and is the big all-seeing scanning eye. I like to think of it almost as like a super wide lens, right? He's giving us like this fisheye lens that shows us absolutely everything, but because it shows us absolutely everything, it also necessarily kind of distorts what we see or makes it look different. So he says right off the bat, he never gets closer than 5 feet away from Lynch and never talked to him. And one of the reasons he was supposedly on set, and he said stuff like this all throughout these articles, which is, possibly untrue, right, was that he's not actually a Hollywood film reporter, which, again, the veracity of that is pretty questionable. I mean, he's literally a professional reporter for Premiere at this exact moment. He was making money reporting for other magazines. So regardless of what he thinks in his head, he, of course, is factually a professional reporter, and in this case for Hollywood. He did the same thing at a lot of the sports events he went to, which I'd love to dig into some of those essays. I don't know how many essays we'll get through in an hour or so today, but maybe we'll revisit this one later. So, the first time I lay actual eyes on real David Lynch on the set of his movie, he's peeing on a tree, period. I'm not kidding. This is January 8th in West LA's Griffith Park, where some of Lost Highway's exteriors and driving scenes are being shot. Lynch is standing in the bristly underbrush of the dirt road between the base camp's trailers and the set, peeing on a stunted tree. Mr. David Lynch, a prodigious coffee drinker, apparently pees hard and often. and neither he nor the production can afford the time it'd take him to run down to the base camp's long line of trailers, to the trailer where the bathrooms are every time he needs to pee. So my first sight of Lynch is only from the back, and, understandably, from a distance. Lost Highway's cast and crew pretty much ignore Lynch's urinating in public, and they ignore it in a relaxed rather than a tense or uncomfortable way. Sort of the way you'd ignore a child's alfresco peeing. Odd bit. Then he throws in the fact that a honey wagon is sort of the phrase we use on film sets. I used to work on film sets and sometimes buy the honey wagon in trailers. But there's all these words, and that jargon, those tidbits are the little pieces of gold that I think Foster Wallace really liked to pull out when he did do reportage. Him, of course, being obsessed with diction and encyclopedic knowledge of, Merriam-Webster is part of Hal's go-to bit in Infinite Jest. Anywho, this first paragraph that I've read aloud, you can see again what's happening here. He says people aren't really paying attention to Lynch, but of course there's a tension there because he's paying attention to Lynch. Not only is he watching the guy pee, he also comes back and reports a full paragraph in quite descriptive detail, including the date of David Lynch's peeing on a tree. I guess that's the colloquialism, the feeling of sort of quotidian day-to-day experience. Okay, our next section is entertainments David Lynch has created, directed, that are mentioned in this article. And so, Eraserhead, The Elephant Man, all classics, Dune, 1984, Blue Velvet, 1986, Wild at Heart, and then all of the Twin Peaks. I would love to do a whole, deep dive and series on Twin Peaks one day. That'd be fun. Even Firewalk with Me, the remake TV movie, is pretty cool. But I want to get back and dig into the bit about Dune, because I feel like it's just the most relevant right now, and it's curious. So let's find where we can find that. We are on page 230. Looks like I don't actually have any notes this essay, and I know various times I read it in person, like in paper. Why did I say in person? That's weird. Okay, here it is. This is it. I remember this. I don't know why. I was just drawn to this idea of talking about this after recently seeing not the Denis Arcand, the Denis Villeneuve, the other Québécois auteur's version of Dune 2 in the theater. 1984's Dune is unquestionably the worst movie of David Lynch's career, and it's pretty darn bad. In some ways, it seems that Lynch was miscast as its director. Eraserhead had been one of those sell your own plasma to buy the film stock masterpieces. He's talking about like having to literally like donate blood or whatever, be a guinea pig test market for the industry of chemicals to try and pay for things, which my college roommate did that. That used to be a thing. Hopefully it's not still a thing. Maybe it is. With the tiny and largely unpaid cast and crew, Dune, on the other hand, had one of the biggest budgets in Hollywood history, and its production staff was the size of a small Caribbean nation. And the movie involved lavish and cutting-edge special effects. Half the 14-month shooting schedule was given over to miniatures and stop action. So huge, long production. 14 months. Woof. Plus, Herbert's novel itself is incredibly long and complex. And so besides all the headaches of a major commercial production financed by men in Ray-Bans, Lynch also had trouble making cinematic sense of the plot, which even in the novel is convoluted to the point of pain. In short, Dune's direction called for a combination technician and administrator, and Lynch, though good as a technician as anyone in film, is more like the type of bright child you sometimes see who's ingenious at structuring fantasies and gets totally immersed in them, but will let other kids take part in them only if he retains complete imaginative control over the game, its rules, and appurtenances. In short, very definitely not an administrator. Okay, this passage, I love it for a lot of reasons. The most obvious of which is that I think Lynch is cooler than David Foster Wallace, right? Lynch lives in LA. DFW is living in wherever he's from, Illinois or some Midwestern place, small town college guy. Lynch is wearing Ray-Bans, for sure a signifier of coolness, of money, of success, which at this point, I don't think Infinite Jest has come out, but certainly it hasn't like made a big splash yet. And so we're talking magazine writer versus Hollywood film director, stature wise, in no comparison, none. And yet, what David Foster Wallace is doing here is pretty clearly a kind of projecting or fantasizing, where he's imagining Lynch as himself, right? As writers so often do with their characters or their subjects. He's more like the bright child you sometimes see who's ingenious at structuring fantasies and gets totally immersed in them, but doesn't get along well with other kids. Well, I mean, that's David Foster Wallace to a T. That's Infinite Jest. It's all of his fiction. I think two of the universe... was it in Oblivion? It must be in Oblivion. The short story where there's a small child who literally plays with toys. I remember it was published in the New Yorker, and he's sort of obsessed with his toys and his toy life, and, i.e. a gifted child type. Let's continue to the next paragraph. So watching Dune again on video, you can see that some of its defects are clearly Lynch's responsibility. Example given. Casting the nerdy and potato-faced Kyle MacLachlan as an epic hero, and the police's resoundingly unthespian Sting as a psycho villain. Or worse, trying to provide plot exposition by having characters' thoughts audibleized with that slight thinking out loud reverb on the soundtrack while the camera zooms in on the character making a thinking face. So this is a Hollywood classic of exposition. Then I was in deep space, and as the Harkonnens approached. Yeah, pretty bad stuff. But, also par for the course of that kind of movie, right? Like, I'd seen Dune 2 recently. It wasn't as bad as the first one. It was better. We can talk about the film, at another time if you want. I'm a big fan of Denis Villeneuve, even though he claims to be a Quebecois separatist from Canada. But it's full of bad exposition. I mean, any long, epic sci-fi movie is going to have crummy exposition layered in, the good ones too. It's just sort of part of the genre. It's a fact of making these kind of films that, especially if you're trying to tell a story that's an 800-page book or a 1,000-page book or from a 6-book series, and you're trying to compress that down into a couple hours, to make the story work, you've got to include some of that exposition. Just rewatching Interstellar lately. I mean, there's a bunch of that, and the Nolan brothers are as good as anyone in the world right now at telling a story, but they still have to have exposition if they're going to talk about complex ideas in a film. It's just kind of how it works. There's certain things, they say show, don't tell. There's certain things you have to tell because you can't show them, right? Like if you're discussing gravity or whatever, or time. Okay. Back to the essay. A cheesy old device that Saturday Night Live had already been parodying for years when Dune came out. The overall result is a movie that's funny while it's trying to be deadly serious, which is a good definition of a flop as there is. And Dune was indeed a huge, pretentious, incoherent flop. But a good part of the incoherence is the responsibility of De Laurentiis' producers, who cut thousands of feet of film out of Lynch's final print right before the movie's release, apparently already smelling disaster and wanting to get the movie down to a more like a normal theatrical running time. Even on video, it's not hard to see where a lot of these cuts were made. The movie looks gutted, unintentionally surreal. Woof. Maybe we should jump in and watch a clip of it. Just for those of you who've never seen any at all screen time of the original Dune 1984, let's do it. All right, that's enough of that. That's interesting to me. A movie that was ripped so badly, and I wonder if it's that, a huge, pretentious, incoherent flop is what Foster Wallace says. I wonder if we're now more accustomed in 2023, 2024, so literally 40 years after the original Dunes came out in theaters. I mean, the number of huge, pretentious, incoherent flops I've seen since then is infinite. I mean, God, for decades, it feels like all Hollywood's been making is huge, incoherent, pretentious flops. especially with the whole Marvel universe. I mean, whatever, come at me. Like, I used to read comic books. Whatever they've been making in Hollywood don't resemble comic books. I do like this Spider-Man cartoon, Across the Universe or whatever it's called. Not Across the Universe, Into the Multiverse. I watched that one with my kid. And that's like legit. That to me feels, true to the comic book form and experience. Anyways, let's get back to this essay. A good part of the incoherence is the responsibility of the producers, yada yada. Basically, they're saying they gutted the film to try and make it more coherent or more watchable. In a strange way, though, Dune actually ended up being Lynch's big break as a filmmaker. The version of Dune that finally appeared in theaters was, by all reliable reports, heartbreaking for him, the kind of debacle that in myths about innocent, idealistic artists and the maw of the Hollywood process signals the violent end of the artist's innocence, seduced, overwhelmed, effed over, left to take the public heat and the mogul's wrath. The experience could easily have turned Lynch into an embittered hack, though probably a rich hack, doing FX-intensive gore fests for commercial studios. Or it could have set him scurrying to the safety of academia, making obscure, plotless 16mm for the pipe and beret crowd. And here, I mean, think of The Father in Infinite Jest and the sort of filmography, and that is something that, although David Foster Wallace skewers it, it's also a world he's like deeply enmeshed and in love with, I think. But he says of Lynch, the experience did neither. Lynch both hung in and on, and on some level gave up. Dune convinced him that all really interesting independent filmmakers, Campion, the Coens, Jarmusch, Jaglom, what a list, seemed to steer by. Quote, this is David Lynch quote now. The experience taught me a valuable lesson, he told an interviewer years later. I learned I would rather not make a film than make one where I don't have the final cut. This is, again, classic, like, myth of the artist thing going on here. And now David Foster Wallace posits, this is what led, in an almost Lynchianly weird way, to Blue Velvet. It had part of a deal which, then he's getting into the sort of the financial deal stuff and, the selling your soul to the devil. I don't want to talk too much about that, so let's, brush forward to this. Anyways, here's Foster Wallace's point. Lynch's innocent idealism had survived Dune, and he cared less about money and production budgets than about regaining control of his fantasy. So he wrote and directed Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet, I think it's in this essay, David Foster Wallace has talked about basically just being obsessed with it, literally deep dive falling in love with it, watching it a zillion times over. So it's visual intimacy and sure touch, a distinctively homemade film, the home being, again, David Lynch's skull. Think about The Father in Infinite Jest, right? Sticking his head in the microwave to blow up his skull, and then, of course, eventually DFW himself also, committing suicide. Blue Velvet was a surprise hit, and it remains one of the 80s great U.S. films. Its greatness is a direct result of Lynch's decision to stay in the process, but to rule in small personal films rather than to serve in large corporate ones. Whether you believe he's a good auteur or a bad one, his career makes it clear that he is indeed, in the literal cahiers de cinema sense, an auteur, willing to make the sorts of sacrifices for creative control that real auteurs have to make. Choices that indicate either raging egotism or passionate dedication or a childlike desire to run the whole sandbox, or all three. This is oh man. To me, this is David Foster Wallace talking to himself, and you think of that later book, the sort of transcripts that came out between him and the interviewee that turned into that movie, although of course you end up becoming yourself. This is Foster Wallace really having a conversation with himself and his own skill, right? He's not reporting on set of the Los Angeles film anymore. He's already admitted he doesn't have access to Lynch. So he's now just going on a full tangent, talking about Blue Velvet, not the film he's reporting or covering. And essentially, I think, comparing how Lynch as a successful auteur is sort of an idealized or version of what Foster Wallace wants to be. And the Cahiers de Cinema reference is to the old French film journal, where, what's his name? One of the great French filmmakers, the run and gun guys, went from that Cahiers de Cinema to making films. It was maybe Maybe Francois Truffaut. I don't know. Get in the comments. You let me know. I'm probably wrong. So, think about this as Foster Wallace commenting on himself as a writer. An auteur willing to make the sorts of sacrifices for creative control that real auteurs have to make. Choices that indicate either raging egotism or passionate dedication or a childlike desire to run the whole sandbox, or all three. Interestingly, I think now also of Denis Villeneuve. Is he that auteur? Probably not. The new Dunes are a little bit more of like a blow-up bang-bang movie, I think. They are just, and what we sort of accept now as, more of a big set-piece action, boom, in-your-face thing. I'm not saying they're bad. I really enjoyed the second one. The first one was terrible for plotting reasons. You can't stop in the middle of a plot and end a movie. That's party foul. Okay. So, now this is when he gets into this big, why he loves Blue Velvet thing, and gets into a lot of sort of blue velvety purple descriptive passages of it about Lynch and the movie and its making. I'm going to sort of slide on through these and not get into it, but okay. So, yeah, this whole section. Approximate number of ways Lost Highway seems like it can be interpreted. Talking about ratings and stuff. No. Not into it. Okay, yeah. So let's get into this chunk. Number 8. What Lynchian means and why it's important. And I think this is relevant today, for various reasons. Lynch is still a huge influence on everyone. But also, the striking similarities between the current Dune remake and the Lynch version of 84. There's no reason for them to be there other than the fact that Denis Villeneuve clearly likes them and feels he owes some sort of whatever allegiance or experiential pass to Lynch, right? I mean, there's no reason for him to be doing this other than that he wants to. Sorry, I found my focus going off there a bit. An academic definition of Lynchian might be the term refers to a particular kind of irony where the very macabre and the very mundane combine in such a way as to reveal the former's perpetual containment within the latter. But like postmodern or pornographic, Lynchian is one of those Potter Stewart type words that's definable only ostensively, i.e., we know it when we see it. So I think the new Dune is Lynchian. Not all the time, but often. Certain scenes, certain bits, they have that feel. I think there's also some Ridley Scott stuff in there, referencing Alien, no S. But let's talk about this. Ted Bundy, nasty. Ted Bundy wasn't particularly Lynchian, but good old Jeffrey Dahmer, with his victims' various anatomies neatly separated and stored in his fridge alongside his chocolate milk and his shed spread, was thoroughgoingly Lynchian. A recent homicide in Boston where the deacon of South Shore Church gave chase to a vehicle that had cut him off, forced the car off the road, and shot the driver with a high-powered crossbow was borderline Lynchian. A domestic-type homicide, on the other hand, could fall on various points along the continuum of Lynchianism. So it's basically analyzing all these murders and saying how Lynchian are they or are they not. I would suggest that some of the murders in the recent Dune remake are definitely Lynchian, especially the stuff with the young fellow, what's his name? Played by that great actor, Austin, you're going to skewer me for getting this wrong. Austin Bennett. Should I look it up? Let's look him up. We'll bust out the old phone. Have a look. Dune 2. Is it just called Dune 2? Yeah, Dune 2 cast. Austin Butler. Yeah. I think quite a few of the Austin Butler murders, the sort of stuff where he's like grotesquely murdering the women that surround him and the sex slaves and the real misogynistic stuff, that feels Lynchian to me. His whole character, obviously, and the Harkonnens in general are extremely Lynchian. They're basically lifted right out of Lynch's interpretation of the book, which I think has its own sort of ode or effect to not Ridley Scott, but the artist H.R. Geiger. Do we know who H.R. Geiger is? The guy who basically did all the designs for Alien. Let's find him, just so you can see what I'm looking at. H.R. Geiger, Swiss artist. I'm immediately recognizable when you see this stuff. Yeah, so there it is behind me. This was a huge influence on Alien and on the original Dune, right? The Dune 1980. It's also like an actual museum of his work, which, man, that would be a cool thing to check out one day. This is a digression, obviously, but I mean, it's kind of the point of what we're doing here is to deep dive and get into some books and the thing I've read, and then look at all the allusions and the breaks, where they connect to. So if you're into that, appreciate it. Make sure to support the channels and in all ways. And okay, let's have a look back. Let's see if we can get a direct reference to H.R. Geiger and Dune. He did some concept art. Yes! This is so bad. But like bad, great. Oh man. So this is a concept drawing that he did in 1974. Look at this big baby. So I actually didn't recognize Stellan Skarsgard for a minute, playing the big fella in the recent Dune. And you can see his literal character looks like a reference to this Dune 2 drawing done by H.R. Geiger in 1974. Let's get them side by side. Right? I mean, I'm not making this up. Okay, everyone's just talking about the fat suit the Baron wears, whatever. I'm not interested in the fat suit. I'm interested in the fact that this drawing, this H.R. Geiger drawing, is clearly an influence for the character of Stellan Skarsgard. So rather than it being the Baron's actual sort of spaceship or house, it's the Baron himself becomes this drawing. I think, was H.R. Geiger's drawing done for Lynch or for Jodorowsky? There's also this whole documentary about another filmmaker, Jodorowsky, who tried to make a Dune and it never got made. And that documentary is also fascinating. You know, to me, as someone who read the whole Dune series and the books when I was a little kid, I don't actually have that much interest in going back and revisiting the books. Like a lot of sort of 70s, 80s California, you know, psychotropically infiltrated dudes, a lot of the writing is just not great for me. It's not interesting. What's interesting is the world creating stuff, and this stuff that Foster Wallace is talking about, how David Lynch creates a world. I'm talking about how David Foster Wallace created a world, and then we're of course connecting those to how Denis Villeneuve is now creating a world, all of which are, you know, based on the context of time and funding and people's interests. So let's get back into this world. I would say too, the whole analysis of psycho killers here is that this was part of that era. There was an obsession with it in the 90s. It's just everywhere on television, this idea of serial killers, the serial killers in the movies and the cop shows and all that stuff. Very much a Gen X fanatical interest. So for me, this is David Foster Wallace. For me, Lynch's movies' deconstruction of this weird irony of the banal has affected the way I see and organize the world. I've noted since 1986 that a good 65% of people in metropolitan bus terminals between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. tend to qualify as Lynchian figures. Flamboyantly unattractive, enfeebled, grotesque, freighted with a woe out of all proportion to evident circumstances. That, my friends, is a Lynchian figure. Stellan Skarsgard, by the way, wildly, I mean, he's successful, but still an underrated actor. He's known now for Pirates of the Caribbean and, of course, this series, and I think he might be in one of the Marvel movies or some other superhero thing. Phenomenal actor. Breaking the Waves. Go check it. Okay, so, flamboyantly unattractive, enfeebled, grotesque, freighted with a woe out of all proportion to evident circumstances. Austin Butler's character, the nephew, also qualifies as this. All the Harkonnens, the whole look, the feel. We've all seen people assuming sudden and grotesque facial expressions, example given, like when receiving shocking news or biting into something that turns out to be foul. There's a whole piece of Infinite Jest where Hal has bitten something foul, some kind of mold, that may also be the cause of his sort of psychic unraveling. Anyways, turns out to be foul, or around small kids for no particular other reason than to be weird. But I've determined that a sudden grotesque facial expression won't qualify as a real Lynchian facial expression unless the expression is held for several moments longer than the circumstances could even possibly warrant. It's just held there, fixed and grotesque, until it starts to signify about 17 different things at once. I think I want to get into this footnote too. Let's see it. This is the first time. We're going to leap across time and space here with a David Foster Wallace trademark footnote. What are we getting? And as an aside, but a true aside, I'll add that I've had since 1986 a personal rule with respect to dating, which is that any date where I go to a female's residence to pick her up and have any kind of conversation with parents or roommates that's an even remotely Lynchian conversation is automatically the only date I ever have with that female, regardless of her appeal in other areas. And that this rule, developed after seeing Blue Velvet, has served me remarkably well and kept me out of all kinds of hair-raising entanglements and jams, and that friends to whom I've promulgated the rule but who have willfully ignored it and have continued dating females with clear elements of Lynchianism in their characters' associations have done so to their regret. Wow! So, it's wrong to say that David Foster Wallace was cancelled, but we will say he certainly fell out of favor. And one of the reasons he fell out of favor, I think, is for this kind of aside, where he just almost like overly descriptive Jerry Seinfeld character just goes on long, wordy, verbose rants about why some woman is unfit for his dating when, of course, it's probably him, right? I mean, the more you date and the more people suck that you're dating, it's your fault. It's not their fault. Yeah, deal with that one. Chew on it for a bit. Okay, I think that's as far as I want to go today with the connections between supposedly funny thing I'll never do, the David Lynch essay, and the frequent Dune movie, or the 84 Dune movie and the 2024 Dune movie. I also didn't talk about the last Dune by Denis Villeneuve because, again, I think it's just terrible the way it ended immediately in the middle of a book, and that's a plotting crime. Let's go back, though, and look for one or two more quotes. Not about Lynch, but about this. Sorry, not about Dune, but about Lynch. If you will keep... Okay, this is under 11A. Why what David Lynch wants from you might be a good thing. If you'll keep in mind the outrageous kinds of moral manipulation we suffer at the hands of most contemporary directors. Okay, should we talk about the Messiah thing in the current Dune? That, to me, is the definition of outrageous moral manipulation. So is that Jake Gyllenhaal, the whole movie where he plays like a kidnapper, angry parent father thing, the Denis Villeneuve movie. What is that one called? Like Taken or something? Enemy? No, Prisoners. Prisoners is this. Prisoners is the epitome of outrageous moral manipulation, which we, the audience, suffer at the hands of most contemporary directors. And don't get me out of context here. I do like Denis Villeneuve, but, bro. Quote, it'll be easier to convince you that something in Lynch's own clinically detached filmmaking is not only refreshing, but redemptive. It's not that Lynch is somehow above being manipulative. It's more like he's just not interested. I think I agree with that statement. I don't know how much of it is time and context, but I did feel that the sort of most trying or wearing aspects of the current Dune movie are that it's pretty obviously manipulating to have a certain point of view or a certain feeling or bias. And it has to do with this idea of, Atreides and the sort of whatever, supposedly Greek influence, but in this case, skinny French kid, Timothée Chalamet, and him going to a world of what in the book is essentially like a mashup of Islamic and Buddhist cultures, but was also really influenced, the author, Frank Herbert, was heavily influenced by like what was going on in Algeria back then, and, existentialism and questions raised by Albert Camus about colonialism and an era of post-colonialism. And clearly Denis Villeneuve has taken that strain, a small through line or thread of the book, and basically tried to explode it, which is interesting. I mean, if he was going to do that, I think I would have personally cast the Fremen differently. I didn't recognize or see many Middle Eastern or Arabic actors playing Fremen. I saw a Spanish dude and Zendaya, but, whatever. That's not really too much the moral manipulation thing. The moral manipulation issue with this, I guess now that we're digging into it, is here. If you're going to have a Messiah character in a movie, you immediately spoil the end of the movie for everyone. So, whatever. If you're 25 minutes into the movie, say, as I was, sitting there, chomping away popcorn, drinking a big soda, being a passive observer, if you know what the Messiah is, you know the end. And that's my biggest issue with the current Dune movie. 20 minutes into the movie, you see, he's playing up the Messiah narrative here, and Atreides is in fact going to be a Messiah. Well, I mean, look it up. I think there's Northrop Frye who said once basically that, like, if you haven't read the King James Bible, or if you don't understand, biblical allusions and references in the story of Christ, you're not going to understand Western culture and Western art and literature. And both Frank Herbert and Denis Villeneuve are most definitely a part of Western art, literature, and culture. And if you do know those stories and you have read the Bible, as soon as you know it's a Messiah, the story's over and the dramatic tension falls out of it. Anyways, okay, that's my criticism of that movie. I did still like it. I did have fun in it. Let's see why David Foster Wallace says Lynch is uninterested in manipulating us. I also think Wallace, for the most part, especially in his fiction, is not interested in manipulating his reader, which is an appealing characteristic. Lynch's movies are about images and stories in his head that he wants to see made, external and complexly real. His most illuminating statement about the making of Eraserhead involves, quote, the exhilaration he felt standing at the set of Mr. and Mrs. X's apartment and realizing that what he had pictured in his mind had been exactly recreated. Whoa, chilling. I do love that idea. A real facsimile, creating a different world, which I think AI and 3D graphics and gaming is really allowing us to do in certain ways too, to step into and take part in the imaginary world. It also reminds me of a famous Yale photographer, artist, Professor Gregory Crewdson. So Crewdson really was influenced by 1980s and 90s cinema and film, and he made these scenes, one-offs that he shot with a huge, large format camera, and really beautiful, stunning sequences. And yeah, look at the lighting on those, right? So the lighting tech and the kind of money he would spend to create these scenes, shutting down whole things. Also, we should give Jeff Wall a good shout. Obviously, Jeff Wall, Vancouver Canadian artist, influenced this. Beautiful stuff. Look at this, eh? Woman at the Sink. God, that's so gorgeous. Gorgeous artwork. But this kind of thing is about that. It's about externalizing and creating a world of your imagination in reality. Indistinguishable from reality, I would say. And I think David Foster Wallace, to some extent, wanted to be able to do that kind of transference with his writing. If we look at the title essay later, we'll get into that. It's already been observed that Lynch brings to his art the sensibility of a very bright child immersed in the minutiae of his own fantasies, like Wallace. This kind of approach has disadvantages. His films are not especially sophisticated or intelligent. There's little critical judgment or quality control type checks on ideas that do not work. Things tend to be hit or miss. I think about Twin Peaks and sort of Fire Walk with Me in that second season when he talks about this. Plus, the films are like a fantasy-prone little kid, self-involved to an extent that's pretty much solipsistic, hence their coldness. Which is very applicable to Wallace himself. But part of the involution and coldness derives from the fact that David Lynch seems to truly possess the capacity for detachment from response that most artists only pay lip service to. He does pretty much what he wants and appears not to give much of a shit whether you like it or even get it. His loyalties are fierce and passionate and almost entirely to himself. That's lovely and true, and I'm not sure if that's true of David Foster Wallace as well. It actually makes me think of the old Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky and Stalker and some of those movies he made. He only made about 5 or 6 movies, and then he died youngish in his mid-50s in London. And that's someone whose loyalties are fierce and passionate and almost entirely to himself. It's one I'd love to look at in this series, so let me know if you're interested. His passionate inwardness is refreshingly childlike, but I notice that very few of us choose to make small children our friends. And as for Lynch's serene detachment from people's response, I've noticed that, while I can't help respect and sort of envy the moral nerve of people who truly do not care what others think of them, people like this also make me nervous. This is real. And I tend to do my admiring from a safe distance. On, again, the other hand, though we need to acknowledge that in this age of Hollywood message films and focus group screenings and pernicious Nielsenism, so Nielsen was the big rating systems. Think about how true this is now of movies. Oh my goodness, it's exponentially more real in the age of the big budget cartoon superhero flick. Quote, cinema by referendum, where we vote with our entertainment dollar, either for spectacular effects to make us feel something or for lullations of moral cliches that let us remain comfortable in our numbness. Lullation is like a lulling to a baby, like a lullaby. Lynch's rather sociopathic lack of interest in our approval seems refreshing and redemptive, if also creepy. Yeah, and that is really the difference between the contemporary remake of Dune by Denis Villeneuve. It seeks our approval in a way that's not refreshing, in a way that really recalls a classic hero's journey, and it also makes it seem more like Star Wars, which, George Lucas was sued, or Frank Herbert tried to sue him for, basically for ripping off Dune. So, fascinating stuff. This connection between David Foster Wallace getting inside Lynch's head, maybe to look at his own head and be self-reflective, and a kind of reportage that we don't really see anymore today, 30 years later, where he's throwing back, cutting across 20 years of this author's work. Anyhow, if you're into this kind of video, this kind of talk, this kind of audio, book analysis, let me know, and I will make more of them on what I'm interested in and anything you want to talk about if I want to talk about it. Thanks so much.